And then we can start. So hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our final day of the Bilateral Labor Agreements Conference. Today we have the longest day. You know, and I think in many ways the richest in terms of the context we're going to touch and already having the background of all of the stuff we've discussed in the last 2 days. So I'm looking forward to a very exciting day. So we're going to start with a panel that we titled, wait, let me have that in front of me, Migration Governance and Migrant Vulnerabilities. And so we're going to have 2 papers presented, and we're going to start with the first. We're going to have Sudarat Musikawang from the Institute for Population and Social Research at Madi Hall University in Thailand, talking about understanding the gaps between the bilateral regularizing of migration and workers' rights, the case of agricultural migrant workers in Thailand. So Sudarat is going to take us to what is often called in the literature south to south migration. A lot of what we've been talking about wasn't about that. So I think this really adds another perspective. And we're going to hear her paper, and then Marius Olivier, that we've already heard from the University of Western Australia Law School, is joining us as a discussant. And I want to particularly thank both of you because the time the time zones in this conference are particularly challenging, and you guys got the short end of the stick in terms of having this very late where you are. So we're really grateful for the time you're spending with us and for presenting and commenting today. So thank you very much. And Sudarat, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you so much, Hila, and thank you to Tamar and to Yahel and the organizers behind the scenes. I really appreciate this, and I'm just gonna try my best to keep time, and forgive me, this is a work in progress. And you know, I'm gonna try my best to keep to the 10 minutes. We'll see how far I get. So this, a little bit of background about Thailand and the region for those who don't know. It is what is known as south to south migration, but also Thailand is a lower middle income country where we have demographic aging out of farmers. We have villagers in rural areas who are migrating to urban areas for work, as well as going abroad to places like South Korea, Israel, Taiwan, Japan, Malaysia. So the other thing about Thailand is it is the 4th ranked destination for migrant workers in Asia. And as of December 2019, we have about 3.9 million migrant workers. There are now 4 MOU relationships between Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. And the agricultural migrants have been predominantly Myanmar and Cambodia and Laos, in that ranking order. Also to note, Thailand increasingly has become an export country with regard to cash crops. And this talk will be discussing how the particular export crops and what migrant workers' experiences are in those export crops. The other thing is that it is a small but significant contribution to the GDP. And the last issue in terms of background I wanted to put out there in terms of framing, to think about how Thailand is trying to solve its mass undocumented immigration issue through migration governance. It's a different kind of framing than to assume that we're always dealing with temporary migrant workers, right? So bilateral agreements have been used much more, but the phenomenon has been happening since the 80s and 90s, right? So I think that that's important to keep in mind. I'm trying to put forward my slide. The other thing is of more recent background, importantly, is that Thailand is a military dictatorship. We've had 2 coups. The most recent is 2014, and those in migration will know that there was huge threat against the undocumented, and there was an exodus of over 200,000 Cambodians trying to just leave because they were afraid of being rounded up by the military government. The other thing is that Thailand is also under enormous pressure because we export seafoods and crops and all of these things. So the TIP report becomes a very important economic pressure aspect of having safe and fair migration, right? So one of the responses that the government has installed is what is called one-stop service. And it is a way of working with neighboring countries to register the undocumented. So many of these persons have no documentation at all, especially from Myanmar, not even a birth certificate. So it's required a whole orchestration. And that was implemented in 2017. At the same time, legislation has imposed huge punitive fines and possible prison time. So just trying to move ahead. And I think one of the things with my papers, the main question is about what are the contradictions between labor rights and what is written in the law and the empirical case of agricultural migrant workers. And I'll be looking at the right of contract, wage and hour, OSH, housing, and residency rights that are denied structurally. Here's a map for those who just to get a sense. We're a landlocked country, which explains the huge mass of undocumented workers. At the same time, these borders are very militarized, but militarized borders does not mean that it's a blockade border. It just means there's more rent extraction happening under the table. So and I do a very rough qualitative content analysis. You saw from the Excel sheet, it's still ongoing, looking at the 3 MOUs and looking at the 2017 Royal Ordinance concerning management of employment of migrant workers. And I crossed that with a project I worked on as a PI with a huge research team. And I have so many NGOs and research assistants and faculty to thank for it. But it took place right around the one-stop service time of between 2017 and 2018. And it was primarily descriptive survey. And it's 4 provinces, and the 4 export crops were in order: sugarcane, corn and maize, rubber, and oil palm. Also included some interviews. And I wanted to explain the kind of tiered, varied documentation that we found in the field. And you'll see everything from border pass only down. That's undocumented workers. They don't have work permits, but they have some form of documents or no documents. And you can see most agricultural workers are undocumented workers, then and now. And the other thing is we're talking about, say, some maybe over 310,000 so workers or so, right? And this is just registered migrant workers, but we can probably multiply, maybe 2 or 3 times. We don't know, because many of them are still vastly undocumented workers. I just wanted to note, you can see these are percentages. In 2017, Section 64, there was border pass legislation that allowed workers to come in. It's geared toward agricultural work, but it is used in the border zones for special economic zone processing areas. And this brings down a lot of costs, and it also brings down the ceiling of workers' protections, and so there's no social security and all of these things. So these are just things to think about in how more regulation doesn't necessarily mean more protections for workers. The the important thing here in this table, I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try to rush, is that the bordering countries, there was a pattern in which, particularly for Myanmar workers in Thak and Cambodia workers in Sakel, they're really coming over with sometimes it's just their border pass only in terms of Cambodian workers. For Myanmar workers, there was an effort to, get their country verification and get a work permit. The other way that I am trying to structure this particular talk is to think about this kind of two-sided coin of technical exclusions and the Cold War architecture that is really built into ASEAN BLA MOUs. And this, I borrow from Stensland, talking about ASEAN context and how much of this, and you can see it written in, that it's about constructive non-confrontational cooperation. That means there's no M&E, there's no intervention to enhance migrant workers' protection, but there's no awareness, right? So awareness is touted, non-intervention. The first thing that is privileged is national security, second, economic interests, right? And respecting other countries' sovereignty. In terms of technical exclusions, they're written into the paper, but some of the most important things, and this is common even in other countries where agriculture and fisheries are excluded.
Like you went on mute for a second. I'm not sure why. I think something was pressed. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it said that one of the hosts muted me. I'm like,
Yes,
oh, did
I have pressed it.
The last word was excused.
So I can maybe send some of this PowerPoint to whoever's interested.
You can take 2 more minutes and continue with this. Yeah,
So,
sorry, it was by mistake. It wasn't on purpose. It wasn't assigned to stop. You can take 2 more minutes.
So I didn't actually get to some of the issues, but there is some, one of the commonalities about the MOUs is about non-discrimination, and the paper tries to show how there's not only discrimination in terms of like pay rate, there, for the most part, if you think about the hours of work that they put in and the amount of compensation, of course, Thai workers are paid more, but also between workers themselves. For example, Cambodian workers and Lao workers are both working in sugarcane, but they're treated differently. And that's partly due because Cambodian workers are, coming in through the border pass, they're undocumented or, that variation. But Lao and Thailand at that time did not have Section 64. They didn't have the border pass. So everybody had to come through the MOU officially. That means you have to have your contract in hand and, so you have Social Security and all of these things, but also there are longstanding relationships between Lao migrants generationally along the border, and it's circular migration. So there are a lot of contextual differences of shared culture and language and, family even. So here it just shows the wage differential, and you can see in Loy where the Lao workers are working, that is very apparent in terms of the wage differential. And the minimum daily wage is $9 per day. Surat Thani is rubber. Rubber workers work incredibly long hours. And so they get paid through percentage. And so one of the exceptions that I wanted to bring up is that, especially for rubber workers, they're considered independent contractors and not necessarily employees. So there's also these kind of exceptions, and they're very technical. You can see the median income between men and women. And this is just about the reason I showed that particular one, and is part of the talk in the paper is to show that the gender wage gap is based on how there's a lot more women earning very little money and a lot more men earning a lot more money. But their hours of work are kind of the same, right? So these are some of the issues that were very clear, and all the 3 MOU BLAs say that for reasons of safety and health in foreign workers, employers must provide appropriate hygienic accommodation for workers, and workers must rest and live in the accommodation provided. And agricultural work is very dangerous. When we did field collection for the survey, we had snakes coming out at us, and the migrant workers were actually protecting us, hitting them and saying, oh, this is great for a stew later. But I mean, some of them are quite dangerous, right? So, this is the kind of housing we're talking about. And I only bring up housing is because you can see that it's completely exposed to conditions, and what has been is supposed to be temporary housing has turned into much more permanent housing. It has exposure to pesticides. Very few people have access to clean water. It's usually pond or groundwater, and there's some serious health issues. The last thing I wanted to bring up is just that, the framework of migrant worker rights, even though we're talking about this, but it is a kind of denial of immigration rights, right? To limit people to just up to that maximum, or in the case of places like Taiwan that allow people to have 12 years of continuous stay, but after that, you're never allowed to come back as a worker, right? You can come back as a tourist. So, I mean, these are ways that we can think about the exclusionary politics of immigration, where immigration law meets, migrant labor law, those kind of issues. Have I run out of time? I think I might have run out of time.
Yes.
Right. So I'll just leave it at that. So thanks so much. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you for this very detailed and fascinating presentation. And again, for those who want to read more, there's so many really, really interesting and troubling more additional information in Sudarat's paper and analysis. So now we turn to our commentator, Marius Olivier. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hila, and Sudarat, thank you for the most fascinating paper, I must say. And my overall impression is this is really a kind of a wake-up call for those of us who, work from the research and very often from the academic perspective, and maybe even from the policy perspective. To really see and to hear what's happening on the ground in a country in Asia. You say it's a country with the 4th largest migration flow to, in Asia as a country of destination. A large number of migrant workers involved. It's a rich contribution. Let me do the following to the extent that we have time. So I'm not using slides, I'm just talking to this. Just 2 or 3 comments on maybe what you can do to maybe improve a bit here and there in the paper. And then to see what are the takeaways that we have from this. And importantly, finally, so what are there possible solutions? Where do we go from here? So on the first issue, for purpose of improvement, I really think it would be helpful if really at the beginning of the paper, if you explain somehow what are the different kind of migration avenues for regular migration. The table you brought up shows that I think there are at least 7 avenues, and would be helpful to know from the beginning what they are, what are the requirements for the different avenues. For the reader to understand many of your other comments that you're making. It took me a while to get a grip on this, and this is even after I did a considerable amount of work on Thailand as part of an ILO report that I did in social protection for migrant workers in ASEAN about 2-3 years ago. The second suggestion is that I think it would be it might be helpful to also mention something about the impact of changing migration or immigration status. Lately, that has been in the news. You know, I remember having seen a contribution on that and how disastrous the impact could be for migrant workers the moment if they change their official status. Then finally, importantly, I really think that the paper will be enriched if you were to come up with some kind of pathways, you know, for where do we go from here? Are there any kind of solutions to deal with the issue? Because for the moment, you do an analysis and you draw certain conclusions, all worthwhile, but there's probably more that one can do. I think I want to touch on that in the final analysis as well. The second area I want to touch on has to do with, so what are the takeaways that we have? And I've tried to classify what I read under four main, maybe five headings. The fifth is actually a conclusion. Maybe I should start with that. Your overall conclusion on the, I think the second last page is to say that as far as bilateralism is concerned, and of course, your understanding of bilateralism is, it actually effectively includes not just the MOUs, but also the whole fact that Thailand is in a bilateral relationship with a number of its neighboring countries. But your final take on this is to say that, yes, Thailand is a country that's aware of labor and human rights. It's being reflected in the MOUs and the regulatory framework, etc., but there's no enforcement. And I think that is, of course, a powerful conclusion. But what are the four main takeaways? Firstly is the insufficient regulation of the whole area of migration, your labor migration in particular, and regulation then from perspective of the ordinance. And I mean, I haven't seen any other country in ASEAN with a more elaborate framework of you know, domestic laws and regulations and on the issue or the area of migration than Thailand. And then on top of that, you also have the MOUs and other arrangements and agreements. So there's a lot of regulation, and yet it's totally insufficient for several reasons. The one is it does not really comply in several respects with international minimum standards, trade union rights mentioned in the paper, migration cost, serious issue, migration indebtedness not being addressed in the regulatory framework according to what you tell us, the unclear regulation as far as undocumented migrants are concerned, and the scope that leaves for, as you call it, you know, grey zone practices, and most importantly, the issue of sector exclusion. So agricultural sector, which is what your paper is all about, you indicate is a kind of excluded sector. So the labor rights framework, you know, does not apply to that sector in general terms, and of course this leads to exploitation, as we know. The second main take that I have, if I look at this paper, is the what shall we call this, kind of like unresponsive or uncooperative government, but even social partner structures and responses. I mean, there are so many examples of where, despite the regulations that we have in place, that the regulatory environment is very often flouted, and the lack of sector coverage, of course, adds to that. But even the employers are, you know, participating in this, as you indicated, paper. And yeah, one remark about the, you don't elaborate on that in the paper, but the trade unions, official trade union body apparently is not really addressing the issue for whatever reason, I don't know. And on top of that, on a policy level, there's a tendency to remove the legal entitlement to residency, for example. So this needs to be addressed. The third takeaway, exploitative practices. It's legalized, as you would call it, practices because of, for example, the sector exclusion, area of minimum wage, working hours, health insurance, the absence of written contracts, most often unregulated document brokers, and so the list continues. And even then, the concealment of employment relationships and trying to couch them as so-called independent contractor relationships. All of that aim to get around even the weak regulatory framework that there may be. And the final takeaway, of course, has to do what is the major impact here? As you indicate in the paper, the negative impact on the health status of migrant workers, the housing conditions, you showed us this particular picture, access to social protection, if I could use the word disastrous, I mean, very, very low levels of coverage of social protection of migrant workers in Thailand, with a few exceptions. So are there solutions? Where do we go from here? So these are just a few ideas, and partly based on work I've done also in the region. To me, it's clear after having read the paper, there is really a need for comprehensive migration reform, including labor migration reform. Is the country open for that, a government? Well, that you may want to answer, but normally it can come as part of a deal with, let's say, organizations such as the ILO or the IAM. But this policy framework needs to be rooted in reality, the reality that you sketch, for example, but certainly it must be guided very strictly by international standards. Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere. The employer pays principle needs to be appropriately reflected, etc. And I must say that even though Thailand hasn't ratified many of the international agreements, it has ratified most, but not all, of the UN Human Rights Conventions. And all of them have migration angles too, and that can be fruitfully used, I would think. The second issue has to do with the pathway forward. A cultural and a mind shift, I think, is required. Government, even at a local level where some of these malpractices occur, with employers, and well, if we have to believe you about what you say in that one sense about trade unions, even at trade union level. So how do we do that? Very difficult, but of course there are intergovernmental structures. I don't think the ASEAN option is going to work. You indicate in the paper that ASEAN has, the framework in ASEAN doesn't have any monetary intervention framework. So we probably need to look at other migration structures, maybe via the ILO, and that applies in particular to the trade union bodies, the international trade union organizations, employee organizations, making use of the ILO Freedom of Association Committee as well, think of a trade union issue. But the question is how to bring these cases to the ILO. The ILO strictly operates on a tripartite structure, as we know. So the only way I could think is that, if these workers were to say, well, we try to organize, we try to have our own leadership in trade unions, we can't have this, so now we are approaching the ILO, but there's no other way you can get your case to the ILO. Thirdly, the human rights instruments and their supervisory organs and reporting mechanisms. And I checked just before the session what Thailand is doing, and it seems to what I see here on the UN Human Rights website that Thailand is actually obliging. It is submitting its report, and it is even opened up to investigations being requested into different areas of human rights concern. To have these matters raised before supervisory organs through reporting mechanisms on which civil society would have to comment, of course. Not easy to get there because Thailand hasn't, except for a few of the conventions, it hasn't really opened up the, this optional protocol, provisions, which would allow an organization such as yours to bring a case. But there are some options there. I'm almost through. I think, and that goes together with the comment on the migration reform, the technical advice that organizations, and I know they're very, very heavily involved in Thailand, especially the ILO, but even the IAM, the technical advice that can be given to indicate to government what is happening, even on the ground, and what can be done to correct this from an international standards perspective, from a policy perspective. And I think good use could and should be made of this. In the second last issue, yes, the second last issue, the judiciary, I at least what I read in the case of the Supreme Administrative Court, and the way in which they extended coverage in 2015 to migrant workers, probably there is an internal route. And finally, it's not an option that I would really like to propose, but of course, for the countries of origin where there's need for support for their own workers, not just to kind of fight a case with the Thailand government, but really to support their own workers, country of origin measures that we briefly reflected on yesterday as well. Thank you, all from my side for now.
Thank you very much, Marius. Sudarat, would you like to respond briefly before we open it up for questions?
Yeah, no, thank you. I very much appreciate Marius's very generous feedback and suggestions on how to improve. So really greatly appreciate it. And I think in terms of trying to answer the question about trade unionism in the agricultural sector is particularly challenging, partly because of the structure of agriculture is small shareholder farmers. There are some larger corporations but they usually work with the small shareholder farmers, so they sometimes function as middle persons. So yeah, land tenureship is still dispersed among families. So there is no active agricultural trade union in Thailand. There are only farm cooperatives, and those are the employers. So that's particularly challenging. Legally speaking, I think some of you already know that migrant workers cannot form their own trade unions. It's a national security threat from the government's perspective. But it doesn't mean that they can't organize, which they do. But particularly for agricultural workers, it's very hard for partnerships between Thai-based NGO migrant advocates and the agricultural sector because they're so hard to get to. It's definitely some of the challenging aspects. I really appreciate the breakdown of some of the possible contributions and concentrations, but maybe I could hear from others. I can continue to think about how to address. Yeah.
Great. Thank you both. So let's begin with Jennifer.
Great. Thank you, Sudarat. I thought this was an amazing study. Just the scope of the work that you've done. I was really blown away by it. So I wanted to first say that. And then I wanted to highlight something in your paper that you didn't emphasize in the presentation, but that had a lot of echoes for me of a conversation we were having yesterday, which is with regard to workers who talk about preferring, because of the structure, to be undocumented than to go through the programs, right? And that, of course, echoed what Ayushman said yesterday about Nepal, and also echoes what I've found in a series of sort of pre-research conversations I've had with Mexican workers choosing between, who have in their lives both been undocumented and gone through the H-2A agricultural worker visa. And so I have this like collection, a little collection of people who in one way or the other have tried to study migrant workers' preferences between being undocumented and going through temporary work programs. And I think it's an issue for us, all of us here, who are seeking to advance in some ways the formality of migration programs. I think it's very hard in that context for two reasons: to slow down and listen to what migrants are saying when they talk about wanting, preferring under the structural conditions, undocumented migration, which we all know is incredibly dangerous, expensive, and precarious, right? The second reason I think it's hard, and the reason I have not yet done the actual research that my pre-research has led to, is I'm a little worried that it's dangerous. That is to say that if, as I think about the possibility of doing a fuller study on that, it feels to me like there are equal chances that my research would be used to further clamp down on migration and close what advantages migrants can take of the system as it is. And I just wanted to comment on that in the context of this larger conversation, and put it on the table for all of us to attend to in our research, that set of questions about migrants' own views of the structure of these programs that we're all working so hard to make better versus what they can achieve through undocumented migration, by contrast, and the complications of paying attention to that. Thanks.
So Sudarat, if it's okay with you, let's take another question and then you can answer and then we'll take another two. Nicola, please.
Yeah, thank you for a fascinating paper. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to read the draft, but I will definitely do so. It's really fascinating work. My question might, to be fair, lead a little bit off the rails. It's just, I was curious, during my last visit to Thailand, which was not at all about research, or you know, sort of more targeted research, it was actually to do with a teaching program I was running at the time. We took the students on an excursion, and this happened to be about Burmese migrants in the seafood sector. And I learned there was an NGO which happened to be partially or entirely funded by the EU. And the talk that was presented to our students was all about global supply chains and how a lot of the seafood, or particularly prawns, because a large market happens to be Europe, there are a lot of transnational advocacy networks around the global supply chains, really looking into the seafood production and the exploitative situation of particular Burmese workers in this particular sector. So I was wondering about agriculture. I mean, obviously, I have absolutely no idea what export countries the crop is being you know, sent to. Is it neighboring Asian countries, or again, is it countries where maybe you know, the consumer issue could be brought into, again, just to pick up on what was earlier said also in terms of solutions, but I'm also acutely aware we are actually supposed to be linking all of this to bilateral agreements. So I was wondering on I guess on the seafood sector, there's probably also no such thing as a bilateral agreement which might be more favorable, or where things work more favorably. I was just wondering if you happen to know, you know, if you sort of compare the two, and yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Nicola. So Sudarat, would you like to respond?
Sure. Let me try to address Nicola's comments. I have thought about seafood, but in a different context, actually, with Taiwan, because my research takes me to Thai migrant workers abroad. Taiwan is a supplier for tuna for some of the major big industry in Thailand that cans to the US and Europe. So it is a global supply chain, and there's been a lot more attention in the press and, you know, even films and documentaries and journalists, in a way that there hasn't been as much for agriculture. So it's a different scope than the bilateral aspects and those kind of things. I think the exceptions in national labor standards, you know, is kind of universal with some of the countries I've seen, even South Korea, you know, with regard to how do they treat seasonal work, you know, and how is it an exception with regard to working hours and days off. And so I think there has to be, I think the ILO has some good mechanisms, like Marius was saying, about how do we rethink agricultural sector, because agricultural work ultimately is not seasonal. People stay the entire year, but they work for multiple employers in the same village. So ILO has some kind of, I think, some mechanisms. So how do we rethink employer and, you know, employee relationships, right? So I think that's one thing that maybe is different. And I don't know that much about seafood, you know, other than what I know about Taiwan. So it's very specific. So I I think in terms of global supply chain accountability, it's really interesting too. I just wrapped up an article for Archives of Criminology looking at this issue of Thailand and US with regard to trafficking issues and accountability because of the TIP report, and how does prosecution work with regard to corporate social responsibility. And apparently some of the cases are not really going through in the US. So it would be really good for the agricultural sector even to get that far, right? We often don't think about how important food is, unless many people die. So, one of the most sad things, I think, I left quite a lot out, of the paper. One of the most sad thing was that in Thak province, this is the ethnographic and interview data is very different than the survey. When we interviewed hospitals and talked to doctors, they talked about how migrant workers were killing themselves with the pesticides. So they were dying from pesticides, not from exposure, but because of suicide, because the wages were so depressed in that province, right? So, there are just so many, it's such rich material that it's hard. So I really appreciate, other eyes like Marius and everybody else to try to help keep me honed in and focused. Going back to, I think, Jennifer, thank you so much for being so nice about to me about the paper. And, I think you're right about thinking of, I worry about this too, because I know, for some of the workers who come in as undocumented, they just walk across, right? And the flows have been happening for generations, and the costs for undocumented workers to find a way here have gone down so much that many of them, they add in minus, and they're like, it's cheaper. It's definitely cheaper. And ultimately, because of legalized wage deductions of 10% of your salary, that's, legal to, so they always have to bear the burden of cost, which has gone up since 2017's regulations. And now it's even gone even higher because of COVID regulations and COVID testing, and workers having to bear the burden of self-quarantining, or if they get sick, or there's a lot of horrible, troubling issues. And I would really like to hear from everyone about, really how would these mechanisms be solved? Because I think one of the things about Thailand is that there's a lot of problems within the Ministry of Labor, and conflict between the division that looks at social protection and welfare versus the Department of Employment, and even issues about corruption, denial, all of these things. So I don't know if that even answers the issue of the undocumented, but the costs have gone up enormously. People pay the burden of costs, especially Cambodian workers who are already in debt.
So for the sake of time, I do want to hear some more. So we'll do very quick questions, and then we'll see if we'll have time for a really quick response, and maybe we can continue in the chat or later in the coffee break. So Shaha and Adam. So Shaha.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
You're a little weak, so maybe if you can disconnect the headphones, it will be better. I'm not sure.
I'm trying.
Try again.
No? Sorry.
It's okay.
Okay, maybe Adam can go on and I'll try to fix it.
No, it's okay. I think we can hear you. Just speak up. So Adam, would you like to go
Sure.
first?
Yeah. First, this is really great, and I love the idea of the research context where you take this issue of migration, but you're able to study it with migrants from different countries and different industries, and combine the analysis of the legal structure and also the survey data. it's really rich the way that you bring all of this together. I had two thoughts on it that might be helpful on the paper. First is I would like to know more about the survey and also the key experts that you interviewed, how you identified them, how the survey was conducted, just any sort of details on the background, which there was in the current version of the paper only a little bit. Yeah. And because it'd just be interesting to understand the methods more. And also for other people that want to do research like this going forward. And then second, related to that, is it would be helpful to discuss, or as I put this in empirical terms, like assign the bias. And what I mean by that is, my guess is that a far higher percent of the workers are undocumented than the survey suggests because of who's willing to talk to an interviewer or the way in which people are likely to lie or whatever it may be. And so it might be helpful to say which of in the different sections of the paper where you go through Social Security or these different things, say, this is likely an underestimate, this might be an overestimate, this might be incomplete, this might be unique to the palm oil industry, et cetera. And to sort of, there's always going to be limits with survey data, but to just sort of tell us what you think the direction of the mistake might be, so to speak. Anyway, great research.
Yeah.
So Shaha?
Is it better now?
A little bit. Just speak up and it'll be fine.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sudarat. And I think I kind of, it's a comment or more question or more direction towards a further research that maybe we could do together, or some of us. And I'm kind of thinking Thailand is a fascinating case because it's a sending and receiving migration country, right? And we spoke a little bit between us yesterday. And I'm kind of thinking now with the changes with the bilateral agreement between Thailand and Israel on the migration of Thais to Israel. So the IOM is out and the Ministry of Labor became, is having a more central role. And I'm kind of wondering in that regard, are the same kind of ministerial bodies are taking care both of out migration and in migration? And where I'm going through with that is kind of to think on Thailand's dual role, also with signing bilateral agreements and also for both ends of the migration route. And then I'm thinking whether there are similarities between the bilateral agreement signed with Israel and the MOU signs with other countries, or where can we identify the same bodies that are not accountable to their own citizens or to those who are coming. So just kind of thoughts around that.
Okay, I'll try to answer
really quickly because we're already 10 minutes behind.
Oh, sorry. Shahar's question, it's the structure of the government. It's really not great. Like I mentioned before, Department of Employment versus the Social Protection people are different wing. The labor attaché that takes care of people abroad is different than, even though they're both in Department of Employment, it's very siloed and competitive against each other, backstabbing even. So it's not, I don't know. I don't know if I should say this so honestly, but yeah. And also the structure of ministers having to rotate out. So mid-level and high-level rotation means that you always have to start over and over again. And the reason they do that is to avoid corruption, right? So there are some serious structural issues with the civil service. But the issue of the survey methodology, I can, this is commissioned by the ILO, so I can maybe just send you the methodology. It's a little bit extensive. Maybe that will be a good way. The folks who, the experts outside, you mean the governmental experts? Is that what you're asking, Adam? I'm not sure. So this Ministry of Labor, and the public health folks in terms of government, and also the welfare, the Division of Human Security and Welfare. So NGOs, various NGOs, private clinics, legal clinics. So that's, yeah, that there was a range and variation in that. But I'm happy just to send you the methodology since we're out of time and overtime. So thanks so much. I'm so sorry.
Don't be. Thank you so much, everybody, for this great discussion. And we will, we'll hopefully continue. I will invite all of you who are interested to move to Wonder during our coffee breaks if you'll be interested, so we can continue the conversation there, including what Jennifer raised, which I think is a key question to many of us researching migration, the issue of responsibility for uncovering or highlighting things that may be working for people on the ground. So I think it'll be really interesting to further discuss that. So thank you, Sudarat, and thank you, Marius, and everybody. And